Hey, everybody.
Hi.
Welcome to Balticon 55 and tonight's panel, which is coming of age stories that are not YA. I have a great panel tonight. I'm Jeanne Adams. I'm your moderator, and I'm going to ask our panelists to introduce themselves, starting with Elora.
Hello. Hello, everyone. You may have seen me at previous Balticons in person. I am one of the many techs and volunteers who tend to look like I'm running around like a chicken with its head cut off. But yeah, I'm here as a panelist for the first time since I've been helping at Balticon.
Excellent. Welcome to the panel side of the dark side. We have cookies.
Always a good
JT, what about you?
Hi, I'm JT Greathouse. I'm a fantasy author from Spokane, Washington. So I'm 3 hours behind y'all, but happy to be here. It's been a pretty fun convention so far. I have had short stories published all over the place, mostly in Beneath Ceaseless Skies. And my debut novel, The Hand of the Sun King, which is a coming of age story that is not YA, is coming out from Galance and Jabberwocky Literary in August, and that is what it will look like when it comes out. This is just the art with a special cover. So yeah, I'm also an educator. I teach high school English, so I have some experience teaching about coming of age stories conceptually and stuff like that too.
Most excellent. And Sarah.
Hi, I'm Sarah Beth Durst. I write fantasy for adults, teens, and kids. Newest book, The Bone Maker. It came out in April from Harper Voyager. It is my 22nd book, and it is about second chances and a whole lot of bone magic.
Cool.
Happy to be here.
I love that cover. That is so gorgeous.
Isn't it pretty?
So
Very
pretty.
pretty cover.
It's so pretty. So one of the things that I found interesting in the blurb about this panel is everybody sort of has a different definition of what coming of age means. And JT, I'm going to start with you. Since you teach it and you've sort of been embroiled in it, what is your definition of a coming of age story?
Sure. When I teach this to my high school students, the way I describe a coming of age story is it's a story in which the protagonist or the main character is going through some kind of transition, usually from childhood to adulthood, hence coming of age. But the more central thing is that there's a change in maturity. So a person goes from being immature in some way or lacking some awareness of the world. And the story is about their process of maturing or growing or becoming more aware of the world and then finding their place in it, given that new awareness.
Right. Sarah, what do you think?
I once heard Jane Yolen described it as getting of wisdom. And I liked that a lot. I think it's stories about the character transforming and stepping from a smaller place into a bigger world. That's how I usually think of it.
Yeah, I like that. Laura, what about you? How do you sort of envision that?
Pretty much kind of like how JT said earlier, like a character who is transitioning from childhood to adulthood or is experiencing some sort of new transition, and it's like an awakening. I'm pretty much agreeing with what JT said, because honestly it makes perfect sense.
Yeah, one of the things I think we've seen a lot more of probably in the last decade is our stories that take an older protagonist, someone who's been thrown into a new situation, or someone who is in a situation and, as Sarah said, has a whole new awakening and expanding of whatever their world happens to be. What are some examples you all can think of? Obviously, Sarah's book and JT's book, but what are some other examples y'all can think of that have an older protagonist that you would consider a coming of age story? Elora, let's start with you.
I can remember when I first read Red Rising by Pierce Brown, with the character of Darrow, of how he has his awakening, like in the beginning of the story, and also like when you're starting to hit like the meat of the book, like the middle of it, and he has this awakening of like how upper society behaves, how they educate their children, and it's pretty much just the in sorry words and just the realization that how he was treated because he was in a lower class of society, like, oh my god, we've been treated horribly.
Right. Now I know Anne McCaffrey did it in several of her stories, and Jennifer Estep has recently done it in her Crush the King series. Or it starts with Kill the Queen, I guess, where it is an older protagonist, and you see someone who's much more mature and settled have to take on a new challenge. But JT, are there some other things that you can think of?
Yeah. So one that is, I think, kind of unusual because it's definitely not YA is Senlin Ascends by Josiah Bancroft, which came out a few years ago, self-published, and then it ended up getting picked up by Orbit. And the main character in that is not, he's a school teacher, and he's like in his 30s. So he's very established. And in fact, one of his main character traits at the beginning of the book is that he doesn't like novelty. He's very like set in his ways. But he gets married, and his wife wants to go on a honeymoon to the Tower of Babel, which is real in this world and like still there. And she wants to go explore it. And so they go on this honeymoon together. It is very kind of uncomfortable for him. He's kind of excited to see it, but he like buys a guidebook because he wants to like have a plan and everything. But then shortly after they arrive, things go badly sideways. And he gets separated from his wife, and he has to find her. And he ends up in the tower and like way out of his element, and his guidebook is kind of useless because it turns out it was kind of a scam. Like it was written by somebody who didn't really know what they were talking about. And it's all about him kind of being destabilized, and then as a character having some of his naivete and some of his like assumptions about how the world works challenged by this experience, and changing into a completely different kind of person over the course of the series. And it's a really, it has all of the same kind of things you usually think of as a coming of age story, but the guy's been an adult for like, 10 years. It's just that this new experience he's having is forcing him to learn more about himself, but also more about the world, in the same way that like 18-year-olds who go out and have to get a job for the first time start learning more about themselves and about the world.
That's a great example. Sarah?
I think the ones that popped into my head when I was first looking at this panel topic were a whole bunch of classic fantasy ones, like specifically the Belgariad popped into my head, because Garion is definitely an adult novel. It's definitely told from an adult perspective. I mean, you're looking back on this child's life. And Garion starts off as a little farm boy and grows up to be, can I spoil like a 30-year-old book? Anyway, it's definitely coming of age in there. Also, Heiress of the Queen with Talia by Mercedes Lackey, 100% coming of age story. And Shea Olmsford, Sword of Shannara, like those classic ones that I read like 3,000 times from age 10 to like now, still read them.
Me too.
Yeah. So I was trying to think of other more recent ones, and the one that I just finished reading is the latest Murderbot books. And I think you could characterize the Murderbot books by Martha Wells as coming of age, because you have this character whose world was very, very small in the beginning, and they have to come to terms with who they are and become a full person. Also, those books are awesome, and I feel the need to mention them in pretty much every panel I'm on. Murderbot Diaries, like you'd think from the title that they wouldn't be charming and delightful, but like so charming and delightful.
I think that I loved all of those books too. I think Lackey has done several where, the characters are adults and then have an experience that rocks their world, as JT was talking about, and changes or broadens their perspective and their, I'm trying to think, the series she wrote with James Mallory, The Outstretched Shadow. The first book is about the character. It is a true coming of age story, but the second and third books take that character into his broader experiences, and the sister, who's already an adult, explores sort of her experience as change and growth. And it's a great series if you haven't read it.
In mind then.
Pardon?
I'll keep that in mind to pick it up when I'm able to.
Yes, it's very interesting because I'm a fan of Mercedes Lackey as herself, and I hadn't known any of James Mallory's work, and I thought their joint work together was superb. Anyway, do you think that this older protagonist, do you think it works better for one gender or another in terms of the success of the story? What do you think, Sarah?
The gender of the character? I
Yeah.
mean, never considered that. It depends the story that you're trying to tell. I mean, the character is so enmeshed with the character is the story. The character is the vessel through which we experience the story and the world. They're so intrinsically tied. I don't know necessarily that there would be any difference. I mean, you've got like Warrior Apprentice by Lois McMaster Bujold would definitely count to me as a coming of age story, and that's got a guy in it, and Miles is fantastic. Most of my characters tend to be women. I think they're awesome, personally.
I think they're awesome too.
Thank you. I'm a
fan.
You had mentioned my book, and I meant to like hold up which one you were talking about.
Absolutely.
Good author thing to do. So it was this one.
Yes, Queen of Blood.
Queen of Blood is the first in my Renthia books, and so bloodthirsty nature spirits is the concept. At any rate, it's got.
But she's essentially a college student when she starts. So she is the sort of the definition of this panel. She's an older protagonist. Now, again, a new adult is not too far from YA, and we're really talking about coming of age stories that are not YA, but that's one I think that really showcases the growth that happens after you're sort of in a position. And somebody just posted in the chat that gender shouldn't make a difference, but publishers do sometimes. There was a long time in early YA especially, and JT can probably speak to this since he taught it, where you didn't have women coming of age stories. Anne of Green Gables was about the only women's coming of age story.
I love Anne of Green Gables.
I do too. But you had a lot of young men, Captains Courageous, and most of the Burroughs, Edgar Rice Burroughs books, problematic as they are for us today, were coming of age stories.
I mean, I think that what it is that the stereotypical stories that used to be told about young women were different. So if you think about like Pride and Prejudice, that is effectively a coming of age story, where the main character learns more about the world and goes through a transformative experience, which is falling in love. And though at first she's very hesitant to fall in love with the guy she ends up falling in love with. But that kind of story of like marriage and and growing up and you know, even like Little House on the Prairie has coming of age elements as the series goes on. It's just it's not the same as like an adventure coming of age story where the character literally like leaves home and goes on an adventure and learns more about the world literally. It was more like there's more of an internal coming of age thing that would happen historically. That said, I think that like somebody in the comments said, I don't think that gender really matters in terms of what stories can be told.
I don't think so.
It's just that like I think that there are audience expectations that might exist where like if somebody picks up what they think is an adventure story and the main character is a woman, they might have certain expectations that come with that. But that's really on them. It's not really on you as the author. You can do whatever you want.
Well, and someone also posted in the chat that and sort of what I was getting at is I think there have been a lot more older protagonist coming of age stories featuring women in the last decade or so, as we have really sort of, and you know, Elora, maybe you can speak to this because I know that you said in your bio that you're a gamer. I think we've seen a lot more of that in the gaming industry where there are a lot more female protagonists.
Yeah, like definitely in the Tomb Raider reboot, you have young Lara. She's presumably a college student, and pretty much the reboot pretty much has her go to this island, and it's just you see the whole. I didn't get a chance to play it yet, but you can see from the trailers I have seen that you see how Lara evolves into the Tomb Raider we all know and love, as it were, because she's very young, very inexperienced, and basically what happens in the events of the reboot, it leaves it changes her profoundly. I
Right.
wouldn't exactly consider it YA because Laura at this point would be in like her early 20s at least.
Right. Right.
So it would be, new adult.
Mhm.
So, but yeah, it is definitely a coming of age tale. And and in a lot of the games where you can play a female protagonist, like in for example, Fallout 4,
Right.
since that's fairly recent, you get is a very eye-opening experience of like what the heck has happened to the world, and like and basically the emotional change that you go through, that the character goes through, it's just like
Well, then
much.
they're playing to that audience, then that's good.
Yeah, and like a lot of players who do play, not necessarily, like younger people, more like you people in your 20s and in your 30s, long day, figured get a game on, and there you go.
Yeah. Yeah. I think that's an interesting switch from the early days of gaming though.
Oh yeah, definitely. Like,
So
no, go ahead.
no, well, I was going to say, what do you think are the advantages? And I'll direct this one, start with you, Sarah. What do you think the advantages for you as a writer, writing a story where the protagonist is older?
Oh, it's so much fun. One of the things I absolutely love about writing for an older audience is that you get to play with reader expectations, because everybody that's coming to a book written for adults and about adults has this history and this like emotional, cultural, historical baggage of the whole genre behind them. I mean, they've all seen Tolkien and read Tolkien and seen Tolkien and Star Wars and everything else. And so they're coming to it with a certain set of expectations. And you get to play with that when you're writing for adults. And when you're writing about adult characters, you get to have the history of that character's personality for them to stand on. You get to draw this whole round person that's been through a whole lot of things and have them experience maybe a familiar story, but in a different way, if that makes sense. You get to have someone that's experienced loss before, that knows what the cost is going to be. And that's what I was playing with in Bone Maker, because it's basically like the Dragonlance crew 25 years later. They think their job is done. They've been heroes. But what happens now, and you get to come at it with that history to the characters, with them knowing what the cost is, which a younger character stepping out of their house for the first time, maybe they don't know the price they're going to have to pay to come of age, but an older character, they know the cost. Do they still do it? That's interesting to write about. So it's fun.
Right. What about you, JT? What do you think?
Kind of along the same lines. I think for me, what's more interesting than writing a coming of age story about older characters is writing a sort of conventional coming of age story about a young person, but with an eye towards an older audience. So the reason for that is I think that when I read YA novels and things like that are targeted towards teenagers, teenagers aren't yet necessarily aware of how little they really understand about the world. And so I'm never really convinced by like the epiphanies that YA novel protagonists have, if that makes sense. It always feels a little bit shallow. And it's a lot more interesting to me to read about that kind of character from the perspective of an adult. So like, if you think about Robin Hobb's Farseer novels, which are very much coming of age novels, it's written as though it's the main character writing his memoirs. And there are moments where he goes in these little sort of digressions about like, he didn't understand what was going on at the time. Right. So he can reflect back on being young and being kind of inexperienced and making bad assumptions. And like, there's a more sort of deep interrogation of character, where it's not just like a young person who's kind of gung-ho about their adventure and then learn something from it that maybe helps them mature. It's like the person writing the story now, or the narrator who's writing about their experience when they were younger, can talk a little bit about the specific, like they can reflect a little bit on how the specific experiences they went through shaped them. I think that that's interesting, and also it can add layers of like thematic resonance to a book that are harder to get at when you're not giving the narrator space to kind of be an older person writing about themselves.
Right.
Like I know even as recently as five or so years ago, I didn't have nearly the depth of understanding of myself as I do now, right?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think that sometimes you get the nuances, like you say, with Farseer. That's always a very interesting, and actually even The Hobbit, where you have someone who's actually telling the story in retrospective and saying, oh, I was such a callow youth and I didn't know. So you get that perspective even within the book. Somebody put in the comments that a lot of things that are written for YA are simplistic. Whereas
Yeah,
I'm going to jump in
I
a
would
different
happen
way.
to
I'm sorry, I'm
agree.
like trying to hold myself in, but can I react for just a second?
Absolutely.
Sure.
YA is in no way more simplistic. It's just they're in a different stage of life. There is an immediacy and a passion and a newness that is absolutely wonderful that way, that you can't achieve if you're coming at it from an older perspective. I don't think one is necessarily better than another. I just think it's a different kind of story. In YA, you're experiencing it for the first time. And there's value in that, especially to a readership that is just starting to stretch their wings for the first time, just encountering it for the first time. Whereas the older reader, they don't necessarily need that in their read. So they're looking for a different kind of story. It's like choosing between like whether you want the pizza or the burrito for dinner. I mean, they're both really delicious, but which one are you in the mood for?
Right.
So,
absolutely. Absolutely.
Sorry, I just
Yeah.
heard
No,
simplicity. I'm like, no, it's just different.
I don't want to.
And you've got the measured, and they both have value. So,
Yeah, I
okay.
don't want to say that like YA is valueless or it's not as complex. It's that it has a different emotional resonance.
Yes.
And it doesn't, as an adult, when I'm reading a YA novel, I'm not going to be as engaged by it because I'm not in that stage of life, right?
Yeah.
So that's why I say like when writing a coming of age story with an adult audience in mind, it creates a different storytelling problem that you're trying to solve, right?
Mm-hmm.
You're no longer writing to an audience who is in need of that sort of immediacy and is living through that experience. You're writing for an audience who has read this kind of story before, and for an audience who does understand the world in their own way and also remembers being young and remembers probably with some cringing some of the mistakes that they made. And so writing a story about that contains those elements of like reflectiveness, and it contains those elements of awareness that being young is to be naive, is I think a very emotionally compelling kind of story.
No, absolutely. As Sarah says, I think they both have their value. What do you think, Elora?
I would happen to agree that, as an adult who does like for like a lot of the games that maybe seem to be geared for a younger audience for like coming of age games. I mean, a lot of the times I'm not in that age bracket. I'm not going through some of these newer experiences. I mean, I guess it kind of seems like a little idealistic to see how, to younger audiences, how YA would treat like, I don't know, like going to college or experiencing some great change from like something that happens during the transition from childhood to adulthood, not just getting older and all that. Like it seems kind of idealistic. I don't know, I'm trying to put words to it, but my brain's just like, yeah, no.
Hey, it's Friday night.
Yeah.
I think one of the books that I recently read that I think did both sets of this really well was Paladin's Grace by T. Kingfisher.
Mm-hmm.
So you had the paladin who was already an experienced and quite world-weary adult. You had the other protagonist whose name I can't call at the moment, who was also experienced and sort of in a new adult realm and was working in a business and all that sort of thing, wasn't young, but didn't have his wider world experience. And the experience that both of them are thrown into, then seeing it from both of those perspectives, somebody who's been in this town, who's always been in this town, and here's this new adventure, and then somebody who's been literally all over that particular world and his reaction to things. The dichotomy of that, I thought, brought both sectors into play in such a way that it made it so appealing to both audiences. So you could read it from the adult perspective, as JT was talking about, looking back at that experience from my adult perspective and going, yeah, I can see why he has some impatience with her experiencing this for the first time. It's like, come on, we gotta go.
Yeah.
I love that.
And I agree with Kelly, who just posted that a lot of Ursula's books have teenage protagonists but don't feel like YA. That's very true. I think that's because she sets her worlds in sort of pre-industrial society. So if the protagonist may be young, but they're already working, they're already an apprentice, they're already a journeyman, they're already that sort of thing. Same thing with Lackey. Sarah, you mentioned Mercedes Lackey earlier. I think a lot of times her protagonists may be young, but they're experienced in the world.
Yeah, I think that's true. They've got a huge amount of responsibility on them that they have to handle. Just to talk for a second from a writing standpoint, from just the technical standpoint, I write both, I write middle grade YA and adult. The key, really, if anybody out there listening is trying to write any of those, is to see the story through the eyes of whatever character is telling it, and to tell it as honestly through their eyes as possible. So if you're telling the story, if you're trying to write a YA, you have to see it through the 16-year-old eyes and be as honest about that as possible. If you go into writing a YA with the idea that you're writing about a teen who makes mistakes and like feels things really super deeply and whatever, you're not seeing them as a character, you're seeing them as a stock teen, and it's not going to work. You're going to read it and be like, oh, it won't work.
This is a stereotype cardboard cutout.
Yeah.
Oh,
and when you're writing adult, even if you're writing adult and you're writing about a teen, it's going to make your language different. Which is why I think, like, I would argue that Golden Compass is an adult novel, because you're viewing Lyra, as she's described, as an unruly child, like ways that a child would never describe themselves through their own eyes. So it shifts your entire style, your sentence structure, your cadence, your rhythm, whose eyes you're seeing the story through, which is why I think you can have an adult coming of age story about a teen that is thoroughly an adult novel. It's whose eyes you're seeing it through.
Right. I think that's a very important point. You know, Elizabeth Moon did a series, 2 or 3 books, where the protagonist is actually aged. She's
the resident population, right?
Yes.
I love those.
And that was very much a coming of age story, in the sense of brand new experience, whole new set of problems and issues to deal with in this stage of life. And so, as JT was sort of saying, it's like, you know, here you are, and things have changed. So what makes it a coming of age is, how do you deal with the change, right? Mm-hmm. So how do you think this older type of protagonist is perceived in the publishing industry? I mean, I want to make sure we get to some questions and answers, but this is one of the things that was sort of in the blurb for our panel is, do you think this is the kind of story that shows, it obviously shows up because we're talking about it now, coming of age stories for youth, for young people, whether it's from the perspective of the adult, as Sarah was saying, with a different language, or whether it's from the perspective of the teen themselves, they're all over the place. But how do you see, you know, and maybe we'll start with you, Elora, because you probably see this a lot in the gaming industry.
I do.
This older protagonist being brought forward, how is that being received both by the audience and by the publishing industry? I'm
thinking of Legend of Zelda Twilight Princess, great game, and just the way that Link experiences his coming of age as you know, not just being the new hero chosen by the gods, or chosen by the god, chosen by the gods. It's been a while. But no, it's just like he realizes he's not just stuck in this little podunk town that you start out in. he gets to experience the world and see how the world functions. And before you get to the point in the game where everything just changes dramatically, he was getting to experience the world at large, and then you have this sudden shift and it's like, oh good gravy, like what? And then you keep playing and it's just, because Link is typically, a mute character. Like, the only times he makes sounds is when, he's attacking or he's in pain or whatnot. And, Link grows as a character. Like in Twilight Princess, he develops more, I would think. And, just look, Nintendo, they don't mess around when it comes to properties like this, to their stories.
Right.
Like,
so obviously
IP.
It worked for them because they sank money into it.
Oh yeah, and basically Twilight Princess was the swan song of the GameCube.
Yeah.
So, and it did really good. Yeah. So,
what are your thoughts, Sarah?
I started a new Breath of the Wild.
Pardon? Oh, Breath of the Wild. Yeah.
Literally just playing it before I came in, and I was just thinking, Link evolves. He wakes up with no memory, and he's got to grow. It's totally coming of age. So, that's.
You're welcome.
So, do you think that it's more popular books wise? And
oh, you want me to answer the question? I'm sorry.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
I'm distracted by Zelda.
Look, totally not my intention. Not my intention one bit. So
this is why I have to outline my books. I have like shiny thing over there. Let's talk about Zelda now. Yay. So yeah, seriously though, what was the question?
How do you think it's being received in publishing and, obviously gaming in the world at large, to have an older protagonist leading the charge?
Well, I have gotten so many emails from readers being like, thank you for putting somebody my age in these books. Because I write a lot about older women that kick butt. And there isn't as much out there as I think there should be. People need to see that your story is not over if you don't get your letter from Hogwarts, You can still be a hero after age 18 if you didn't achieve your life dream by the time you were out of college. It's okay.
You don't age out of adventure. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. Oh, that's beautiful. Yes, I think that should be in a t-shirt.
That should be a t-shirt. Yeah.
I'll get on that right away.
Okay.
JT, what are your thoughts?
I do think it is unfortunate that the publishing industry doesn't do this more, because I think that there's sort of a perception that the target audience for most mass media is people ages like 18 to 27 or whatever, because that's kind of the target marketing demographic. But I actually, having worked at a bookstore for a while, most of the people who shop for books are not that age group. And there are books out there that have older protagonists. I'm trying to think of as many as I can, but one that comes to mind that it's extremely good, and it's also kind of controversial in the fandom it's relevant to, is Tehanu by Ursula K. Le Guin, which was the fourth book in the Earthsea series, and it shifts from being about kind of like a YA adventure series about this guy who is growing up and becoming a wizard, to being about a woman that he had saved in a previous book. And it's a much more domestic story, but it's still kind of got that coming of age element where she is sort of settling into a new stage of life. Now that she's kind of had some adventures, and she's settling back down to sort of living in one place, doing some farming, and then also helping him recover from some of the trauma he went through in his adventures. And it's a really good book. It's not the same as the previous ones in the series, but it has so much depth to it that adds to the whole series, because you're seeing these characters now having gone through a lot, and now having to kind of reconcile their lives and figure out what they want to do now that the adventures are over. And there was a book that came out a couple of years ago. I'm blanking on the title now, Oh, Kings of the Wild, which was kind of similar, but it was like getting the band back together was literally the joke, where it was like an adventuring band who had retired and now they were getting back together to go on one last adventure, and they're all like in their 50s, and there are a lot of jokes about like their knees hurting when they're like fighting, and but it's cool, and it's like it has that different perspective in the characters where they have different concerns and different things that they're worried about than your standard sort of fantasy main character. And I think that in the last 10 years or so, there's been a big disruption in fantasy and science fiction in terms of like trying to have more different perspectives in the discourse and writing different kinds of books, like Murderbot being part of that as a representation of like sort of neuroatypical experience, but also an agender character, as somebody in chat pointed out. But I was trying to think, and I still don't see a ton of older protagonists, which is too bad. And I think that that's mostly because publishing is skittish about, people when they don't think there's a market for something.
Right.
And
Which
you kind
is
of
so
just
silly because they must not have gone to a con because
right.
Exactly.
And also
like
they're
the people buying in the bookstore are not 18 to 27 as much as they are 25 to 75.
Now look, to be fair, I don't look my age, but I am not in my 20s no more. So,
Yeah, and I think it's just because that's the demographic that has the most disposable income or whatever, and so that's
or
that's
so think they do.
Yeah, at least they think they do.
Right. They don't have as many responsibilities, but they're like the marketing target. But I think that I also don't think that age group wouldn't be interested in reading about older protagonists. Like Kings of the Wild was a smash hit, and I saw it came out when I was working at the store, and I saw younger readers buying it too. So I do think if you're gonna write that kind of book, or you're gonna write something about an older protagonist, just be aware that you will have a slightly more uphill battle potentially, just because it's a little outside sort of the stereotypical band of what publishing is looking for in fantasy and science fiction.
Right. It's interesting because McCaffrey, I think, was established by the time she wrote Nemesia's Ship, and she wrote the Freedom's Landing series, all those with older protagonists, and then Elizabeth Moon's second series with Kiri Phelan, and I can't remember what the second set is called, but we have a question from the audience, and so anybody in the chat who wants to ask a question, please put it in the Q&A. Have you encountered a book labeled YA that you felt wasn't YA, and vice versa? Let's start with you, Sarah.
All the time. Yeah, I mean, labels are so mushy. I mean, they exist for marketing purposes. They exist to help readers find, if they find a book they like, to find others like it by sticking them together on shelves. But they change, they evolve. There's definitely things that were published a while, like, okay, here's an example, Beauty by Robin Mckinley. The version I own from the 80s, I guess, is this ace paperback, and she's in this like sort of low bodice. It's all like romancy looking and pastel-y colors and so forth.
I have that book in just that copy.
And now it's published as middle grade and trade paperback with a young girl holding a rose. Like, it's exactly the same words. It's packaged differently now. So you definitely run across things that I've read and I'm like, this doesn't feel YA to me. Like The Thief by Megan Whalen Turner, which is a fantastic series. It's always marketed as YA, and I don't know, it never really struck me as feeling YA. And Golden Compass, I definitely feel as an adult novel. And I think when it, could be wrong about this, but I think when it was originally published in Australia or someplace, it did come out as an adult novel, and here it did not, because there's a talking polar bear. And people automatically assume if there's talking animal, it must be middle grade.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
Crazy, but so yes. I mean, it happens with my books all of the time. I mean, it's part of it is because I have written YA, so people assume, oh, these books are YA, but like Bone Maker has nobody under the age of 40. There are no teens in this book at all, and it's still like, oh, there's a YA, but like, no, they're like 50. Like all of them are 50.
And Jennifer Estep was quick to point out in every single blurb for the Kill the Queen series. Not YA, people, not YA. There's sex in these books, not YA. What do you see in your reading, Elora? Do you see books that are labeled YA that you don't think they are, or labeled adult that you think were more YA?
I think Hunger Games at first was labeled YA, but when I read through it, it didn't really seem like that. I mean, like Katniss knows everything's all kinds of messed up because, you know, of everything that's been going on for the past 70 plus years and all. And like, it didn't seem YA to me. It really didn't. But when I first read through Red Rising, because I picked up the advanced copy at Balticon 48, that kind of, it wasn't labeled YA as much because I think it was something, I think the blurb is like a cross of Hunger Games and Game of Thrones or something like that. Anyway, no, it kind of felt YA because Darrow at the time, he's 16, but he's experienced more life than the others in the upper classes of society have. But
yeah,
the more he experiences the upper classes, the more he realizes that what he knew at first is way different than what he experiences.
Right. I think that you see that somewhat with AJ Hartley's series. Oh, what's the name of that? The first book, can't remember the name of it. But the protagonist is a youngster, but in no way childlike. And to me, it did not come across as a YA book because it's pretty grimdark. And the follow-up to it was as well. And even though the protagonist is older in the follow-up, neither one of them really read to me as YA. What about you, JT? What do you think?
So the one that I can think of that when I read it, it didn't feel like an adult novel. It felt more like YA, was actually Mistborn, the first, the Final Empire, I guess, the first Mistborn book. And it has since been repackaged into a YA format. And the reason for that was just because it was 100% a coming of age novel. It was very, very like clean in the sense that like there wasn't a whole lot that any parent would find objectionable beyond like the violence. But even that was kind of, you know, not super gritty.
Yeah, you're right about Mistborn. But
the other thing I would say is that like I am not a person who thinks that YA is a very coherent or hard thing. It is like Sarah was saying, it's a marketing category, and it's actually changed. Like what is YA and what isn't YA is very different now than it was like 15 years ago. I actually watched this happening when I was working at our local indie bookstore, as more and more stuff that was very dark and gritty and kind of edgy was ending up in the YA section, whereas before that wouldn't have been there, if that makes sense.
Right.
So it's not necessarily to say that just because something is gritty, it must be adult, or just because something is adult, it must be gritty. It's that like when I was growing up, if you went into the YA section of a book, it meant one thing. Now it means something different. Oh, yeah. And so like, I don't know if I feel like again, the way this works is there's a trend, and then the marketing people see the trend happening, and so they decide to package books to fit that trend. And I think that Mistborn repackaged into YA is part of that. It's part of like YA is becoming bigger, it's becoming more epic, it's becoming more complicated. Like the Shadow and Bone novels are a great example of that, where like it's borderline, is this adult or not? It has some definite YA tropes and elements to it. It's got a young kind of naive protagonist, but it's also got a lot of really dark stuff in it, and it's got, you know, some pretty edgy things as the series goes on. But that's just the nature of marketing categories. That's the nature of genres.
Right. Somebody just posted in the chat, I think you can split YA from adult fantasy without dunking on either one. And I think that's absolutely true.
Oh, yeah.
The book I was trying to think of AJ Hartley's is called Steeplejack. And it was published as YA. And I think that it can be read as from an adult perspective and be much more, you can get a nuance from it either way, I think. And I think that's one thing we've seen, as you were talking about, JT, much more in the last few years, is that adults are reading YA with a different perspective, and people are reading, who are YA aged, if you will, are reading adult novels with the same sort of result. You know, they're seeing different perspectives from each one of it. So
I think that's right. I think what can make a really good novel is that you can come back to it at different points in your life and find something new, that it'll resonate in a different way.
Absolutely.
Like, two of the books I have been reading through that life has been conspiring against me to finish have been Oathbreaker by Brandon Sanderson and Iron Gold, which is book 4 in the Red Rising series by Pierce Brown. They're not YA, but I'm starting to see elements of YA. Oathbringer is book 3 in the Stormlight Archive, because I saw someone post in the chat about that. And there are some elements of YA, like coming of age, like experiencing a transition, experiencing a new thing, a new experience. I know, run on, but yes, Oathbringer. Thank you, Keelan in the chat. Thank you. But yeah, like I'm starting to see bits of YA in both. And Iron Gold is the first part of a second trilogy for the Red Rising series. And Darrow, he's now an adult. He's close to my age. But you can tell that what he did like 10 years previously in the first trilogy, pretty much there are things at work you don't know quite what they are yet, but it changes Darrow.
And see, I actually like that when you have a coming of age story and then you can read the older section, like the next trilogy is where they are in an older, and you mentioned, Sarah, you mentioned the Belgariad. That's one of the things I always loved about it, is that you could see that growth. Well, unfortunately, we have run out of time. So we are sort of at the end of our panel. What I'd love to do is have each of you tell where we can find you here at Balticon and also on the web. And then we will be in Discord in, was it Water Tower? No, Water
Table.
Water Table. See, I knew it was water. I got the water part right.
It is in the section for the, one moment. It is in the, it will be under the, programming and panel discussion section of the Discord server.
On Discord, yeah.
It will be on Discord in the Word Table channel.
And any of these folks who can go on afterwards will be there. So JT, why don't you tell us where we can find you on the web, and if you're on other panels of Balticon this weekend?
Sure. So I'm most easily found on Twitter at Jeremy TEG. I'm on there more than I probably should be. I also have a website, which is just jtgreathouse.com. I don't post there very often, but I do throw news up on there every once in a while. And as far as the convention, I'm doing a reading from the first chapter of my novel tomorrow, I think at 11 a.m. your time, or 11:30. And then I'm on a few more panels this week. The one I'm really excited about is on Monday. We're going to be doing a panel on first-person narration. And there's a lot of really cool people on it, and I'm pretty excited.
Cool. Sarah?
I'm me at www.sarahbeththirst.com and on all social media at sarahbeththirst. Here at Balticon, I'll be doing 2 panels on Sunday, 10 a.m., How Much World Building is Too Much? At 4 p.m., I'm looking at my sheet, using writing prompts and exercises effectively. And on Monday, 11:30, plot and character growth. And Monday, 1 p.m., revising your work. So
okay, Elora?
Okay, so on the web, you can find me on Twitter under my handle Poison Stripes. I will post link to my Twitter on the channel. As far as panels, as far as the rest of Balticon goes, I am one of the many techs and volunteers who helps make this whole convention happen. The other 3 panels I am doing this con are, I am running Mary Shelley and the first pandemic sci-fi novel, which is on Saturday at 5:30. Then there's Stepping Outside Your Genre Comfort Zone on Sunday at 2:30. and then Future Utopia or Tacitly Terrifying on Monday at 11:30.
All right. Well, I'm being told we have to wrap. So thank you all for being here. And thank you for being at Balticon 55.
Bye-bye.
See you in the water table.
Yep.